Good day. America's long war in Afghanistan has now ended with the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. It's now been confirmed that all the troops have been withdrawn, and though we are likely to hear and see some continuing airstrikes going on across the country over the next few weeks and months, the major fighting is over and the Taliban is once more in control. I would add briefly and in parenthesis that I do wonder for how much longer the United States will be able to continue to carry out airstrikes in Afghanistan. Doing so, of course, requires the cooperation of the countries that surround Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and the Central Asian states, and I wonder to what extent they will be prepared to continue to give the United States overflight rights. Anyway, let's put that aside and let's recap and let's consider in this program why the United States lost in Afghanistan. Now, when I say lost, I think perhaps that word needs to be explained, because it seems to me that there's always, in the aftermath of a war like this, a struggle, a desire on the part of people to redefine defeat, just as they once redefined victory. And I would say that the United States did lose in Afghanistan, and the reason I say that is because if you look at the objectives it set itself when it began this war way back in 2001, it's clear that none of them has been achieved to any significant extent. Yes, Osama is dead, but his organization, Al-Qaeda, still exists. The Taliban, which was overthrown in 2001, is now triumphantly back in control. And as I discussed in a recent video, Afghanistan, far from being rid of jihadi terrorist groups, now has a new one operating on its territory, IS Khorasan, which it seems to me is arguably an even more dangerous and violent organization than Al-Qaeda itself was. So if you treat those as the objectives that the United States set itself when it went to war in Afghanistan, to overthrow the Taliban and to eliminate jihadi terrorism in that country, well, as of now, the United States has failed. It may be that eventually those jihadi groups will be driven out of Afghanistan, but of course the great paradox is that they will be driven out not by the United States, but by the Taliban, supported by the neighboring countries, including countries like Russia, China, and Iran, with which the United States currently has extremely bad relations. So the immediate objectives, the announced objectives that the United States set itself when it went to war in Afghanistan in 2001 have not been realized to any real degree or extent. And in that respect, the war is clearly a failure. But of course, the failure actually goes beyond that, because the United States, once it gained control of Afghanistan in 2001, steadily increased the scale of its ambitions in the country. Firstly, it committed itself, as we all know, to establishing Afghanistan as a stable democracy, as it like to call it, in reality a client state of the United States, with a government beholden to and aligned with the United States. And it also sought to use Afghanistan as a platform, a launch pad to extend its influence into Central Asia. Now, this isn't much talked about today. In fact, it's not talked about at all. You won't find any commentaries in the New York Times or the Washington Post or on SNBC or in the Guardian or the Times of London about how the United States sought to extend its influence via Afghanistan into Central Asia. But that was widely discussed and widely commented upon at the time in the mainstream media back in 2001. I remember reading all about the various plans the United States had for Central Asia at that time, its interest in the supposedly abundant natural resources of that region, and of course the United States also had bases at that time in Kyrgyzstan, in Uzbekistan, and for a brief period in Tajikistan too, and was clearly aiming to oust Russian influence from the region. So if we are going to consider these wider, more grander ambitions, well, those have also collapsed and collapsed completely. And the entire US project, which, as I said, was extensively and openly discussed in the media in 2001, of extending its influence into Central Asia via Afghanistan, well, that has also completely and utterly failed. US influence has collapsed there, and the Russians and the Chinese are the undisputed victors. And of course, there was a third objective, which was to put pressure on Iran, to try and encircle Iran, to try to stage a situation whereby the government of Iran itself might be overthrown. And again, in the immediate aftermath of the US invasion of Afghanistan, we heard a lot of talk about the so-called axis of evil, with Iran, of course, being a prominent member of that supposed axis. And the government of Iran is still there. It is still standing. In fact, it has taken a further turn away from the United States, becoming, in fact, more distant, even more hostile, if you prefer, to the United States, and continuing to wage its covert war and conflict with the United States and with Israel across the Middle East. So every single one of the objectives that the United States set itself when it went into Afghanistan in 2001 and in the year which followed has failed. Afghanistan is once again ruled by the Taliban. It is not a US client state by any stretch of the imagination. Jihadi terrorism still exists, and there are still jihadi terrorists operating in Afghanistan itself. The attempt to extend US influence into Central Asia has collapsed, and Iran is still there with the government, the same government that it had back in 2001, and all that talk of the axis of evil has come to nothing. So this indisputably is a failure. I would say it's not just a failure, it is a defeat in which the United States has been obliged to leave Afghanistan, where all the trillions of dollars that it poured into the country have achieved no return, and where it has been publicly and embarrassingly humiliated. But when we talk about a defeat on one side, we also need to remember that there's been a victory on the part of the other. And in this case, it seems to me that the Taliban's victory is clear-cut. Now, the Taliban were, of course, the power in most of Afghanistan back in 2001. They were ousted from power by the United States in alliance with various Afghan warlords, making up the so-called Northern Alliance. However, they reorganized themselves, they established a rural insurgency, they fought back, they drove the United States to negotiations, they managed to get the United States to commit to a full withdrawal, and following that withdrawal, they have defeated and overthrown the government that the United States sponsored in Afghanistan, and they are once more the government of Afghanistan. In fact, they are more of the government of Afghanistan than they were in 2001, because in 2001, most large areas of Afghanistan were outside the Taliban's control. There are still today parts of Afghanistan which the Taliban do not control, but they control much more of it than they did in 2001. And of course, on top of that, the Taliban this time are much closer to getting general international recognition for their government than they were in 2001. In 2001, the Taliban were recognized as the government of Afghanistan by a few Muslim states, primarily Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. This time, they are negotiating with powerful countries like China, Russia, and Iran, and there is every prospect that their government will soon be recognized internationally, with Turkey perhaps making the first move. So, from every conceivable point of view, the Taliban have achieved their objectives. They're back in control of Afghanistan, more of Afghanistan than they were in control of back in 2001. They have defeated the United States, driven it to negotiations and forcing it to leave the country. And on top of that, they have a real prospect this time of getting their government, the government they're going to establish in Afghanistan, internationally recognized by the international community, or at least by significant parts of it. So, an American defeat, a Taliban victory. How did it happen? Why did it happen in the way that it did? Well, arguing it, looking at it in the way that I have just done, separating the American defeat from the Taliban victory, I think helps us to understand a little better what happened. And I say that because, of course, there have been many explanations which, in my opinion, are often valid, but which don't look at the thing holistically and don't consider, firstly, why America lost, and then the separate question of why the Taliban won. And here I think we can, firstly, by looking at Afghanistan itself, and then at considering how the United States waged its war there, I think we can gain some understanding and insight into how both of these events, the American defeat and the Taliban victory, took place. Now, let's first focus on Afghanistan, which is, of course, the country that we're talking about, which is the country where this American defeat and this Taliban victory took place. And is there something about the history and culture and geography of this country that explains these two rather striking and important facts? Well, I think this is, in fact, conventional thinking, that obviously is. Afghanistan is a very poor country. Communications are very, very underdeveloped. It's highly mountainous. It's extremely decentralized. Central government in Kabul has never been very strong. It's never enough to control Kabul itself in order to be able to control the entire country. And of course, as many people have discovered, the people of Afghanistan have a martial reputation, a martial tradition. They're prepared to fight, to defend their homes, their country, and their faith, and that makes them extremely difficult to conquer. Nonetheless, I am uneasy about some of this talk about Afghanistan being the supposed graveyard of empires. Certainly, it is a case that attempts in recent years to establish control of Afghanistan by outside powers have not gone well. But I think that perhaps rather simplifies or oversimplifies the reality. I think one of the reasons why Afghanistan has proved so difficult to conquer, why it has proved almost all but impossible to establish an enduring government there, beholden to outside powers, goes back to certain recent events in Afghan history, which are perhaps not widely appreciated or understood. Now, it's fair to point out, and it's a fact which many people do not seem to want to recall, that for many years, for something like 40 years, before the Afghan wars began in the 1970s, Afghanistan was largely at peace. It was actually very much a part in those days, in the 60s, of the so-called hippie trail. Lots of Western visitors travelled to the country, and if you go back and look at pictures and photographs of Afghanistan in that time, you will see an essentially peaceful country. It must be said, a very poor one, one where people in the countryside lived lives of hardship and toil, but one which was at peace. And of course it was presided over throughout that period of 40 or so years by the king of Afghanistan, a rather interesting man, Zahir Shah, who was a wily and skilled diplomatist, one who was extremely capable at playing off the superpowers of the period, the United States and the Soviet Union, against each other. He hosted, for example, President Eisenhower in the 1950s, the only time, to my knowledge, by the way, that an American president has ever visited Afghanistan. And of course, he was also on very good terms with the Soviets. And he seems to have had a good understanding of the clan and tribal politics of Afghanistan. And he was also able to keep all of these various parts of Afghanistan, the various component communities that make up Afghanistan, at peace with each other and to some extent in balance with each other. And then in 1973, something happened. He was overthrown whilst away in Rome in a coup by his cousin Mohammed Daoud. And I am going to say that, in my opinion, this was the true start of the problems of Afghanistan, in the sense that Zahir Shah, able diplomatist that he was, had failed to develop the country to any significant degree. He'd managed to persuade both the Soviets and the Americans to invest in infrastructure in the country, but he'd left the country extremely poor. Large parts of it were extremely underdeveloped. There was widespread and growing dissatisfaction with his rule in the cities, and of course, even in the countryside, there was a sort of wary acceptance of his rule rather than a full support for it. Nonetheless, he was the legitimate ruler of the country, accepted as such by all sections of Afghan society. When he was removed in that coup, and when his cousin Mohammed Daoud took power, that legitimacy was lost. And I think this is a major factor in everything that has followed. No government that has held power in Afghanistan since the ouster of Zahir Shah in that coup in 1973 has been able to achieve the degree of legitimacy which he possessed as Afghanistan's king. Even though that legitimacy was grudgingly provided, as I said, it was acknowledged and accepted by all Afghan communities. That was certainly not the case with all the governments which followed. And it was not the case with the government of Mohammed Daoud. Now, Daoud's problem was that though he was able to maintain a reasonable relationship with the people in the countryside, the conservative countryside, where he copied the policies of Zahir Shah and did not interfere much with their way of life, he also failed, and failed completely, in carrying out any significant development of Afghanistan, any economic development or social development of the country. And this was extremely unpopular in Afghanistan's major cities, most specifically in Kabul itself. Now, it's important to say that Zahir Shah's failure to carry out that development was also unpopular in the cities, but nonetheless, he was able to hold things together because he possessed that magic quality of legitimacy. Daoud did not possess it, and it was only a question of time, therefore, before he was challenged, and he was challenged in the cities. And the challenge came from an organization, a party, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, which is often described in the West as a communist party, but which is perhaps more accurately described as socialist, left-leaning, and pro-Soviet, which was widely popular at this time. We're talking, of course, about the 1970s in the cities, first and foremost in Kabul itself. And the key point about the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, is that it also had considerable support within the military, where many of the military officers had been sent by Zahir Shah for training to the Soviet Union, and where many of them had accepted and become devotees of Soviet ideology. And the result was that Mohammed Daoud never was able to control Afghanistan or the cities to any very great degree, and as insecure rulers often do, he became increasingly authoritarian as he tried to maintain and preserve his grip. And in 1978, he tried to crack down on protests led by the PDPA in Kabul, and that in turn provoked a coup against him by the military, and that coup brought the PDPA to power in Afghanistan in what is sometimes referred to as the Sour Revolution of 1978. It took place, in fact, in April 1978. And so we had a situation in 1978 where the PDPA became suddenly and perhaps unexpectedly the governing power in Afghanistan. Now, the PDPA, finding itself in this position, faced certain obstacles. On the one hand, it was strongly committed to that program of economic and social development of Afghanistan that neither Zahir Shah nor Mohammed Daoud had been able to follow, and which was strongly supported by the population of the cities and by the Afghan intelligentsia concentrated in Kabul itself, and also in the officer class of the Afghan military. But it did not have much support in the much more conservative countryside. And in addition, and on top of that, as it turned out, the PDPA was deeply divided. Within the PDPA, there were two distinct factions, the so-called Parcham and Halk, and I'm not going to discuss in this program what the differences between these factions were. They seem to have been more clan and family-based than ideological. And within the dominant faction, which was the Halk faction, there were also disagreements and disputes between the leaders of the Halk faction, which were in overall control, Nur Muhammad Taraki and Hafizullah Amin. Now, the policy of the PDPA was a radical one. They attempted to carry out major reforms across Afghanistan. They, in particular, sought to radically transform conditions in the Afghan countryside. They launched these reforms despite receiving advice from the Soviet Union that those reforms would be unpopular and would provoke opposition in the countryside, and despite Soviet advice that a much more effective approach would be an incremental one. And on top of that, the PDPA began to engage in increasingly violent interfactional struggle, with Halk purging Parcham and with Nur Muhammad Taraki, the initial leader of Halk, being eventually purged and murdered by Hafizullah Amin. So by the middle of 1979, there was already considerable violence in the country, with the countryside, rejecting the PDPA government, which did not have much in the way of legitimacy in the countryside, and with the government itself in severe difficulties as a result of the factional infighting that was going on within it. And then, of course, in 1979, things took an even worse turn for the PDPA, because in 1979, the United States government, under the advice of the then president, Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, committed itself to supporting the rural insurgency, which was at that time emerging against the PDPA. And it did that with the overt purpose of trying to draw the Soviet Union into Afghanistan itself, and to launching against the Soviet Union and the Soviet military the same sort of counterinsurgency war that the United States had fought and lost recently in Vietnam. And the Soviets, for their part, complied bizarrely with these American plans, despite the fact that they were well aware of them, which makes the Soviet decision in 1979 to intervene in Afghanistan exceptionally strange and very bizarre, and in some ways very difficult to understand. It's in fact a reflection of the overall decay in Soviet policy making, that the Soviets walked into this trap that the Americans had laid for them in Afghanistan with open eyes. Moreover, they did so in a particularly bizarre and cack-handed way, going in, engaging, involving themselves in the factional infighting within the PDPA, and actually murdering themselves, the then leader, the then temporary leader, the leader who had emerged as the winner of that factional infighting, Hafizullah Amin, and substituting another PDPA official, Babrak Karmal, who came from the alternative Parcham faction. Doing so not only meant that the Soviets had become involved in the Afghan civil war, which was by this point raging in the countryside, and had fallen into the trap that the Americans had laid for them. It also meant that with the Soviets murdering the president of the country, their intervention in Afghanistan could be plausibly and indeed legally defined as an invasion of the country. And indeed, there was massive international outrage against what the Soviets had done, orchestrated, I should say, by the United States and by Britain. And of course, on the back of that outrage, the United States cranked up its support for the rural insurgency, which was raging against the PDPA across Afghanistan, and which the Soviets were now committed to defeating. So we have a situation where we have a government with a narrow base, a narrow social base in Kabul itself, but one which at least did derive from organic developments within the country, but whose legitimacy was seriously challenged or outright rejected across the countryside, and which had only very imperfect control over the country, which was seeking to carry out a radical and ambitious reform program, which was meeting with intense resistance, and which had become dependent upon Soviet military support and military aid. And in the 1980s, the country therefore plunged into severe war. However, as many have pointed out, it remains the case that the Soviets did manage ultimately to pull things together. And the reason I think they were able to do that was because they fought the war in the 1980s in Afghanistan intelligently, maintaining fairly limited objectives, which was to try to control of the cities and to try to win over various Afghan chiefs to the side of the government by, to some extent, downplaying the reform programs that the PDPA was launching, whilst at the same time quietly building up the strength of the PDPA in the cities themselves, in places like Kabul and Mazar-e Sharif and Herat and those sort of places. And this policy was largely successful. By the late 1980s, much of Afghanistan, contrary to what you read in much of the Western media, was in relative peace. The PDPA government had largely sorted itself out. It had a new leader, a charismatic and intelligent leader, Mohammad Najibullah, and its army, its military, which was based upon the original Afghan military inherited from Zahir Shah, but extensively retrained and re-equipped by the Soviets, was functioning efficiently. So when the Soviets did decide to leave in 1988, 1989, that government, contrary to all expectations, survived. Indeed, it continued to defeat the remaining part of the rural insurgency, the Mujahideen, as they were called, despite the Mujahideen receiving generous support from the West. And in fact, for a period after the Soviet withdrawal, the Najibullah government, the PDPA government, actually increased the areas of Afghanistan it controlled and was in control of most of the country. But then, of course, things took a further spiral downwards because, as we all know, the Soviet Union itself disintegrated. It also collapsed in 1991, and under American pressure, the succeeding government of Boris Yeltsin cut off economic and military aid to the PDPA government in Kabul, and a coup then took place within that government led by an Afghan general, General Dostum. I know many people in Afghanistan believe he was bribed to do it by the United States, but of course I don't know that for a fact. And the result was that the government did finally collapse. The PDPA government did finally collapse. And in its collapse, it took down, and this is key, the remaining Afghan government institutions left over from the era of the king. The army disintegrated, so did the government and the state bureaucracy. The Afghan government that had been patiently built up since the 1930s and which had then been strengthened by the Soviets ceased to exist. And whatever ephemeral legitimacy the PDPA by this point had as the government of Afghanistan was thereby lost. And no political force or entity in Afghanistan since then has been able to take the place either of the king or of the PDPA. None of them has achieved the degree of legitimacy which either the king or the PDPA had managed at some level to acquire. The principal legitimacy was that of the king, which was largely accepted across the entire country. The PDPA had a certain amount of legitimacy in the cities and with some of the communities in Afghanistan, but it was never as strong or as clear-cut as that of the king. But at least they did have some legitimacy, and they did have certain governmental institutions, but such as they were, such as it was, that legitimacy after 1992 was lost. And from that point on, Afghanistan has been in a state of war of all against all. And matters were made worse because the various Mujahideen groupings that had fought the PDPA government were never able to agree amongst themselves on a stable government in Kabul, and of course that government anyway was always rejected by large sections of the country. And in the 1990s, as a result, Afghanistan descended into total chaos, and out of that chaos, eventually, a militant organization, possibly sponsored by Pakistan, emerged in the form of the Taliban. Now, the Taliban were finally able to gain control of most, though far from all, of Afghanistan in the mid-1990s, and to establish themselves as the effective rulers of the country, but it is of most of the country. But it is important to stress again that the Taliban never obtained or achieved in the 1990s the level of legitimacy that either the king or the PDPA had once had, or the degree of control that either the king or the PDPA once had. Instead, their rule was tenuous and widely opposed, and in 2001, when the United States attacked Afghanistan, the Taliban government disintegrated at extraordinary speed. And now we have the next attempt at Afghan state building, which was of course carried out by the United States. And here I think is where many of the major mistakes were made, and where the United States, I think, failed to understand Afghanistan's principal problem. I have said that many of the problems in Afghanistan go back to the coup against the king in 1973, and the fact that no government since has had the level of legitimacy in Afghanistan that the king once did. And I think that the United States never understood this, and they never understood also the importance of trying to rebuild Afghanistan on the basis of whatever institutions had existed under the king and to a certain extent under the PDPA. In other words, trying to reconstitute the old Afghan government and the old Afghan bureaucracy built up first by the king and then by the PDPA. Instead, they tried to do something completely different. They tried to start all over again, treating 2001 as Afghanistan's year zero and thinking that they could rebuild Afghanistan entirely from the bottom up and recreate it or reconstitute it as, in effect, an American client state. So they rejected proposals that the king himself, who was at this time in exile in Rome, should return to Afghanistan and resume his rule there. And they rejected proposals that the Afghan army should be rebuilt on the basis of the Afghan army that had existed under the king and the PDPA, despite the fact that large numbers of officers from that army were still around and still willing to serve. In fact, I can remember how the United States went out of its way at the time to say that it was not prepared to work with so-called communist soldiers, branding every soldier that had served either for the king or for the PDPA as, in effect, a communist. And instead, it tried to set up a new government from scratch and a new army from scratch and a new bureaucracy from scratch. None of these, of course, having the legitimacy that either the king or the PDPA once had. And this, in my opinion, was the problem. Because when a government is set up by a foreign power in a country, one which has no legitimacy and cannot have legitimacy because it is not the product of the political forces of the country itself, but is handpicked for it by an outside power, that government will, of course, lack legitimacy and lack authority across the country. So how does it function? How does it bind people to itself? How does it get its decisions obeyed and accepted? Well, since it lacks legitimacy and lacks the power that legitimacy confers, it can do only one of two things. Firstly, it can use coercion, and of course the Afghan government did try to do that to some extent, but since its means of coercion were always limited, it fell back on something else instead, which is corruption. And there's been much discussion about Afghanistan and the extraordinary corruption that, of course, existed there under the governments of Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani. But, of course, the point to understand that is that in the absence of legitimacy, corruption became the organizing principle of Afghan politics and the only effective mechanism that the Afghan government had to consolidate its control and to extend its control across the country. So when people say that the Afghan government was corrupt, and when people say that the United States failed to tackle the corruption of that government, what, in my opinion, they failed to understand is that it was that corruption which actually made the government functional at all. Without it, it would not have been able to function or survive because it was not legitimate in the eyes of most of the people of the country. Now, the problem with trying to create an entire political system around corruption is that, of course, corruption is deeply unpopular. Now, there'd been a certain amount of corruption in Afghanistan under the king. There was apparently less whilst the PDPA was in power. The PDPA, for all their political mistakes and their propensity to violence and authoritarianism, were committed ideologues and therefore not corrupt. But of course, corruption under the new government of Hamid Karzai and Ashraf Ghani grew to enormous dimensions because, as I said, there was nothing else really that the government had in order to bind the entire country together. And that corruption was then made worse by something else, which is that the United States, faced by a problem of a weak government, lacking legitimacy, unable to control the countryside, did what it always does when faced with a problem, which is that it threw money at it. And it threw more money at it, and still more money. And of course, the money just exploded. It got bigger. It became out of control. And it reached the level of trillions of dollars. And nobody seems to know exactly how much money the United States actually did throw at Afghanistan. And that in itself is a sign of how completely out of control the entire process in Afghanistan had become. And this again is symptomatic, to my mind, of a fundamental weakness in American policy, which is that the United States always thinks that by throwing money at a problem, the problem will go away. And it also tends to think that the way to defeat an enemy is to fight it in the American style, with heavy use of high technology, with a military that is bureaucratically organized at the command level. The soldiers themselves may be brave and disciplined, but the leadership tends to lead the military from the rear in air-conditioned offices in Washington, or in this case in Kabul or Doha, and where the emphasis always is on air power, on drones, on helicopters, on sophisticated equipment, and all the rest. And of course, if you throw trillions of dollars into a system that is structured around corruption, and if you throw expensive equipment to a military that is created by such a corrupt system, all you're going to do is you're going to make the problem of corruption even worse. And of course, corruption does two things. First of all, it demoralizes those people within the political system that you're trying to create who want to be honest but find that they cannot be because the entire system around them is corrupt. And what it also does is that it draws to that system the worst elements of the society. You get gangsters, drugs dealers, warlords, all sorts of people who engage in extraordinary levels of abuse. They are drawn to a system which is effectively corrupt and even at some level criminal. Why, in fact, be a criminal outside the system when you can be far more richly rewarded by becoming a criminal within the system, so that the entire government structure becomes corrupt, demoralized, and at several levels operates almost like a criminal enterprise. And what, of course, that does in turn is that it inevitably alienates the government structure that you are trying to create from the society at large. Most people in most places loathe corruption. In a society like Afghanistan, deeply conservative in many respects, extremely traditional, where life is harsh and austere, the extraordinary corruption of the political class became obnoxious to millions of its people. And what inevitably happened is that they turned to a resistance against a foreign occupation, which they rightly saw, and I stress rightly saw, as the creator and begetter of that corruption, and against the political structure and the military structure that occupying power had created, and which was so corrupt and so predatory in the way which I have described. And of course, they did so by turning to the Taliban, that organization which was never entirely destroyed by the Americans in 2001, and which began rapidly to revive. And here one has to say that the Taliban, seeing this enormous access of strength that it was getting, managed to organize the resistance across Afghanistan with surprising and indeed remarkable skill. And it did so by taking a different course from the course it had taken in the 1990s. It understood that in order to prevail against the power in Kabul, the government in Kabul, and against the United States, it would need to unite large sections, a critical mass of the Afghan population behind it, and that meant that it would have to pursue more moderate policies, and that it would have to emphasize its position as a resistance movement rather than as a religious jihadi fundamentalist one, and give the Taliban its due, perhaps with advice from some of its friends in Pakistan and other places. It did that, and it did succeed successfully in organizing what was and what became rapidly a national resistance against the government in Kabul. And here I think we have the clue to the whole puzzle and to the reason why the government of the PDPA was able to survive for 3 years after the Soviets left, whilst the government in Kabul, created by the Americans, collapsed so quickly. Because the resistance against the PDPA government in the 1980s was never a national resistance in the way that the resistance led by the Taliban was. There was always a critical mass of Afghans in the cities who supported the PDPA and what it was doing. And as I said previously, the institutions of the Afghan state, the army, the police, the state bureaucracy, continued to function, the same institutions left over from the time of the king, and continued to conceive of themselves as the Afghan national army and government and bureaucracy and police resisting a rural insurgency backed by outside powers that was accepted by the officers and the soldiers of that army and by those civil servants as threatening the state itself. So though there was opposition to the PDPA government, it never took the form of a national resistance movement to that government that brought in all the various elements that made up Afghan society. Whereas with the Taliban, it was different. The Taliban, unlike the Mujahideen, were able to persuade and convince a critical mass of Afghans that they were the resistance against the Americans and the government that the Americans had established in Afghanistan, and that they were, in effect, the resistance against what they called the occupiers. And that is what gave the Taliban that critical degree of support across the entire country, which the Mujahideen, by contrast, in the 1980s had lacked. And that is why, unlike the Najibullah government in 1989, when the Americans withdrew, the government that the Americans established almost immediately imploded. It had no support of any significance across most of the country. The army was not able to fight for it. There's been various attempts recently to try to claim that the Afghan military, felt itself somehow betrayed by the departure of the United States and that it was equipped and trained for the wrong war. Well, all of that is true, but even that doesn't explain, to my mind, the speed and completeness of its collapse and its complete disappearance into the mist. And the only explanation for that is that Afghan soldiers and Afghan policemen and Afghan officers simply didn't feel that they were serving an army or a government that really merited real service. A corrupt system is one whose component parts are predatory and violent, and some of the elements which make it up might be prepared to kill for. They're not generally prepared to die for it, and they weren't prepared to die for it in this case. And that is why, it seems to me, the Taliban won and the Americans lost. It is because the United States in 2001, in its folly and its hubris, failing to understand the realities of the country, tried to start from scratch, tried to create an entirely new political, military, economic and bureaucratic structure, one that it had created itself, one which was not based on indigenous forces in Afghanistan. Now, having said all of this, I don't want to deny, I don't want to dispute at all, that there are lots of people in Kabul who are very unhappy by recent developments and who did indeed manage to find a political and a social space in the cities to develop and build their own lives and do so successfully. And I think it's important to say that many of the claims that have been made about Afghanistan in the last 20 years evolving into some sort of democracy are wildly overstated. At the time of its fall, the elections to the Afghan parliament had been continuously postponed, and Ashraf Ghani, the last profoundly corrupt president of the country, had been elected in a presidential election where apparently only a fifth of Afghans voted. My own opinion is that even that probably overstates the degree of support he had and the degree to which the government in Kabul was a democracy. A political system which is organized around corruption can never be truly democratic, because democracy taken to those lengths, corruption taken to those lengths, is fundamentally inconsistent with democracy, which is, after all, government by the people and accountable to the people. The people cannot rule if their government is in effect a corrupt, semi-criminal enterprise, which is what the Afghan government had become. Now, again, in saying that, I don't want to imply that every single official, every single soldier who served for the Afghan government was on the take. But again, the point is that a critical mass of them were. And that ultimately is what matters. So it seems to me that the cause for this defeat must be found in those two factors: an underlying lack of legitimacy, which has been a problem for all Afghan governments since 1973, made immeasurably worse by a fatal decision by the United States in 2001 to prioritize not setting up a new government that would achieve legitimacy in the country by basing it on indigenous Afghan institutions, but instead by the United States trying to set up a compliant government in its own image, thereby creating that monster of corruption which has destroyed everything in turn. Well, where do we go from here? The United States has now left. The Taliban are in control. They've come to power in Afghanistan, as I said, as a national resistance movement. The big question is, will they achieve that level of legitimacy which the king once had and which the PDPA only very partially had? Will they achieve that legitimacy, and will they establish themselves as the government of the country in a way that the king once did? Well, it seems to me that at one level they might be in a better position to do that than every government that has been formed in Afghanistan since the overthrow of the king has been able to do. And that is precisely because of the way they have come to power as a national resistance movement, fighting the foreign occupiers, the Americans, and defeating a government in Kabul, which was seen as illegitimate and which was so monstrously corrupt. But of course, that legitimacy that comes from being the country's resistance movement is very easily lost if the Taliban reverts to type and behaves like it did in the 1990s, like a sectarian, fundamentalist, religious, Pashtun-based movement. This is going to be a major test of the degree to which the Taliban can now build on its success in the war and its success in presenting itself to a critical mass of the Afghan people, perhaps not the educated class in Kabul, but the large mass of the people in the countryside and in the cities, in the towns and the small towns and cities and villages across the country as a legitimate force, which means behaving like a government and not like a sectarian grouping. Perhaps a big challenge to ask of them. So far, as I've said, they seem to be making some intelligent moves. They've talked about setting up an inclusive government. They've talked about pursuing international recognition. They've talked about fighting jihadi terrorists in their midst, something which, by the way, is essential to gain the support of most Afghans who do not want to see terrorist groupings in their midst composed principally of violent and self-interested outsiders from elsewhere in Central Asia and from the Arab world. But we will see. It's a moment, a tantalizing moment, when a government might be established with the degree of legitimacy that the former king once had. But it could easily be, the moment could easily be squandered and lost, in which case we could very well find ourselves facing again the same degree of collapse that we saw in Afghanistan in the 1990s, with no force, no political force, having the legitimacy, the moral and political force, and that degree of political acceptance that can convert itself into a government, a stable government for the whole country. I cannot predict the future, but I think if we understand the past, if we understand that the problem is one of a lack of legitimate government in the country for the last 50 years, then we are closer to getting to a sense of what needs to be done and perhaps what may be done. Well, thank you for listening to this long program. I've set out my own views about the story of Afghanistan, about the problems there, and about the kind of crisis that Afghanistan has had. Maybe, as I said, we are now finally at the beginning of the end of that long crisis. Or perhaps it's just another twist in it. We shall see. But thank you anyway for listening to this long program and bearing it through to the end. I hope it's explained some things. And of course, those of you who disagree with it are very welcome to discuss it on our thread, both on our thread in YouTube and of course, principally and mainly on our other platforms. There we have a large and thriving community on Locals, for example, where you can express and discuss all of these things. You can easily become a member of our Locals community. If you aren't so already, please check the links under this video. And of course, you can also join us and join our other communities on our other platforms. And I would especially refer you to SuperU, the new free speech platform, and also Rumble. So thank you for joining me for this long program. You can look us up and check out our other channels. Our channels like our main channel, the Duran, and of course Alex Christophorou's channel. You find links under this video, and bear in mind you can see all our videos aggregated in one place in our other platforms, on Locals, for example, and on SuperU. And also, do please go to those platforms. Please do consider actively becoming members. I've discussed in recent programs, and especially on a video that I did in our main channel, the Duran, the pressures we are under and the extraordinary and, in my opinion, utterly wrong decision made by PayPal. I'm using measured language. And in light of that, perhaps if you value our content and our analysis and feel that your thoughts have been provoked by it, you can do so by coming to and seeing it on those other platforms, where you can do so in the secure and confident knowledge that come what may, we will always be there. Anyway, if you also want to support us, well, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. And please also don't forget to come to our shop to see the wonderful things we have there, our amazing mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And thank you again for joining me for this long, somewhat analytical and discursive video. I hope you've found points in it that might be of some interest to you. And I look forward, obviously, to you joining me again. And thank you once more. And please press the like button if you've liked this video. And please also remember to check your subscription to our YouTube channel, to my YouTube channel. And please, as I said, also think of becoming a member on our other platforms. Thank you once more. I look forward to you joining me again here and elsewhere. And have a wonderful day.